Our next speaker, Dr. Paul LaViolette, currently serves as the president of the Starburst Foundation, where he conducts research in physics, astronomy, geology, climatology, and psychology. He currently holds a BA in physics from Johns Hopkins University and a Ph.D. in systems science from Portland State University. He's the author of 6 books, the most recently entitled Secrets of Antigravity Propulsion. Please allow me to welcome to the stage Dr. Paul LaViolette.
Thank you, John. Okay, let me get the... Go back to the beginning here. Okay. Now we're ready. So it's an interesting symposium, huh? Well, I'll be speaking about new propulsion, aerospace propulsion technologies that are the next step beyond rockets and jets. This is a quote from Ben Rich, who is the head of Lockheed Skunk Works. In 1995, he said, "We already have the means to travel among the stars, but these technologies are locked up in black projects, and it would take an act of God to ever get them out to benefit humanity." So one of the purposes in writing my book that you saw just on the previous slide was to make an attempt to try to reverse engineer some of these technologies from morsels we get from here and there and what has been written about them to try to explain how they work so that we don't have to wait for disclosure, that we can start building these now. And this is what I've tried to do in the book. I also present a new physics that predicts some of these effects. Let's say we want to go to Mars. NASA tells us that it would take at least 9 months to get there with rocket technology. What if I told you we could do this in less than 5 days with these new propulsion technologies? This was a dream of Townsend Brown's. Townsend Brown was a researcher. He grew up in Ohio to a well-to-do family. He was born in 1905. And when he was only 10 years old, he mounted a X-ray tube, Coolidge tube, and when he energized it with 100,000 volts, he found it moved. And he thought that was unusual. And he thought maybe somehow he was affecting gravity with the high voltage that he applied. And he thought maybe one day this could get us to Mars. So as a hobby, he began experimenting with high voltage on capacitors. Capacitor is basically a dielectric or insulator with 2 metal plates on each side. And you charge up the capacitor with high voltage. And when Brown was building some of these capacitors, he called them gravitators, he found that they moved towards the positively charged pole. And this has come to be known as the field of electrogravitics, the idea that you can affect gravity with voltage, with electricity. He built a device here. Let's see if we can use the pointer. I don't know exactly how to use the pointer. I was told you can use the tracking, but apparently it doesn't. So this device is sort of would rotate. Each gravitator would push itself towards its positively charged end when charged. So at the age of 17, he entered Caltech, and he tried to convince his professors about this new phenomenon he discovered. but was unable to convince them. By that time, general relativity had taken its foothold, and this was not something that seemed to fit. So discouraged, he transferred to Kenyon College in Ohio, and then somewhat later transferred to Denison, and there he met Paul Byfield, who was physics professor, and who was more open to his interests. In fact, Byfield himself had an interest in motion of capacitors. This is one experiment Brown did, both working at the university and then after he graduated, he continued his studies. He hung a gravitator capacitor, basically, that he would add lead to the capacitor to make it more massive, because his theory was that this was a gravitational effect. So the more massive he'd make the capacitor, the more force he could get. And he hung this like a pendulum from the ceiling, and when he charged it, it would move. He had an oil bath to keep the ions from leaking from it. But one thing he found was that the pendulum would gradually subside back to plumb position. So if you applied just DC, high voltage DC, eventually the effect would disappear. He didn't really explain why that was, and that's really the secret to this phenomenon he discovered. He kept it to himself, I believe, but it's possible to figure out what was going on, and that is, as the capacitor, when you apply the charge, initially the dielectric is unpolarized, but as the charge is kept on the plates, the dielectric ions will start to migrate and develop a polarization opposed to the polarization that you're applying. So if there's a gravitational effect toward the positive pole, now this vector you see here will actually begin canceling it out until the dielectric is fully polarized, and then the two cancel. So what was important is that he charge and discharge repeatedly his capacitor to maintain the effect. He submitted a paper to Physical Review, I believe it was, but it was rejected, presumably, again, because it conflicted with general relativity's concepts. He then published in Science and Invention magazine. This is the 1929 issue, which he published. And here's his paper, How I Control Gravitation. This magazine is equivalent to Popular Mechanics or Popular Science that we have today. So here are some photos of some of his gravitators and the work he was doing. He went into the Navy, and then he had his own foundation, his own research institute, in which he continued his work on electrogravitics. And one experiment he did was right here in LA. He had offices in a laboratory right in LA in which he flew disks around a circle, sort of with a maypole apparatus. He was able to get speeds of like 12 to 17 miles per hour, and these were 1.5 feet in diameter disks. He would charge positively the leading edge and negatively the trailing edge. And he showed this to Pearl Harbor Navy personnel. I don't have the exact date for the first demonstration. It must have generated some interest. And then here you see the disk up close. It's from a photo the Townsend Brown family has provided, has put some of these images on the internet. Then in 1953, in April, he did a press conference. He wanted to communicate what he was doing to the public, perhaps because he was fearing that it may be classified, which actually turned out to be the case. That shortly after, it was a subject that was at least he was discouraged from talking about it. But here, he actually wrote up a press release, and his group there, Mason Rose and Brad Shank, were working with him. And it says, flying saucers explained by men of New Research University here. Townsend Brown also had office in Washington, D.C., and there he founded NICAP, which many of you are probably familiar with, the UFO organization that was in working for several years there. He felt that by studying UFOs, he could gain insight to how they worked and maybe further develop his gravity control technology with what they were seeing. Well, this is not rocket science. With a rocket, you have action and reaction. The exhaust going out is what propels the rocket forward. This obeys Newton's third law. Newton's third law is every action has an equal and opposite reaction. But with electrogravitics, this is a violation of Newton's third law. You get action without reaction. In other words, with the gravity, he's electrically influencing gravity and doesn't need to throw mass in the opposite direction to get the motion. So this is a way of picturing it. On the positive pole, it's as if he's creating a gravity well, just as if there was a very massive object at that location. On the negative pole, he's getting the opposite effect, a gravity hill. So it's almost like an anti-gravitic effect. And between them is a slope, a gravity potential gradient. And this gradient is what moves the capacitor. And he found that the effect increased both with the voltage he put. The higher the voltage, the greater the effect. Also, the greater the amount of charge put on the plates, the greater effect. And that's partly determined by the K factor of the capacitor. A capacitor, well, if the capacitor was just plain air, its K would be equal to 1. But if it's like barium titanate, it would have a K factor of 5 to 10,000, which means you, for the same amount of voltage, you get 5 to 10,000 times more charge on your capacitor. Also, he found that the more massive he made the capacitor, the greater the effect. He was getting something like initially, in his early experiments, 1% force compared to the weight of the capacitor. Now, general relativity cannot explain this. General relativity assumes it's only possible to form gravity wells, and also only when a mass is present. It predicts no connection between electric charge and gravity. This was a problem that was torturing Einstein up until when he died in 1956. He may have been aware of Brown's research because it's said that he met Brown in the time that Brown was working with the Navy, the Bureau of Ships. Einstein was also consulting with the Navy. So I'd be surprised if Einstein didn't know about Brown's work. And so he felt a need to try to unify electricity and gravitation, but he couldn't manage in the framework of general relativity of space-time warping. It just wasn't possible. Now, there's one theory I developed called subquantum kinetics, which does predict Townsend Brown's effect. I published this in the International Journal of General Systems in 1985. Refereed journal. They devoted the whole journal to the theory. It was a series of 3 papers. And I wrote it as a book in 1994, which is now in the 3rd edition, expanded edition, which was published just last year. Now, subquantum kinetics has several salient points. First, it's been in existence for over 30 years as a theory. It has Secondly, a sound conceptual basis, in that it's developed by applying systems concepts to physics. Systems theory is a field of science that's been applied to many disciplines. It's really an interdisciplinary science, viewing nature as systems and how systems come into being, how they interact, how they function. The idea of the open system is a key concept. Like, we are open systems. We have to continually eat to maintain our bodies. We're in a state of flux continually. And when these concepts were applied to the specific specialized disciplines, they usually ended up improving, creating advances in the field. Nobody had applied the concepts to microphysics, and so that's what I did, and the result was subquantum kinetics. It shifted, the basic ideas shift out of mechanics more towards chemistry, actually. You deal with an ether in this. Another point is that as of now, subquantum kinetics has made 12 predictions, which were subsequently verified. So these were predictions I was making in my papers, or I was making statements about what the theory was saying, which were contrary to what physics, or the common belief in physics, was. And later, information came out which verified what I was saying. Compared to Einstein's theory, for example, he had 3 confirmations of his general relativity theory. Also, I published 8 papers in refereed journals about this in this period. It's also a unified field theory. It not only unifies electricity and gravitation, but also the strong force, what binds nucleons together, the beta decay, how neutron decays to produce proton and electron, and many things that I don't have time to go into. It would take a couple hours just to go over this, but with the latest development, I've been able to explain quantum interconnectedness. This is just this year, with the idea that you find that actually information can be superluminally connected between particles that link, even though they're remotely separated. The theory, it's entirely consistent with Tesla's thinking. If Tesla was here, I'm sure he would have agreed with the basic principles. It also unifies physics with the life sciences, which has been a problem. Like, physics has been off here and the life sciences here. Well, this, you find that the principles that apply to life sciences also at the basis apply to physics. Actually, it makes physics more understandable and more intuitive, actually. And also, there's links to esoteric thought, and the theory appears to have ancient roots. You find that the concepts are encoded in ancient creation myths, like the Egyptian creation myths, ancient Greek creation myth, the Mesopotamian creation myth. You find it in the Tarot, in the I Ching. It's sort of like they use the method of metaphor to convey the basic concepts. Now, the question is whether the people back then understood this knowledge that was encoded. The thing is that today we have advanced to a point where reading these myths, we can see the science encoded. And this is explained in my book, Genesis of the Cosmos. It leads you to believe that some very advanced civilization was responsible for doing this encoding. Now, if this gray box shows conventional physics, subquantum kinetics is able to expand the scope of what can be explained. So it can embrace things like anti-gravity, free energy, things like this that currently are claimed to be impossible in physics framework. One of the main principles is the idea of flux. Heraclitus, ancient Greek philosopher from the 5th century BC, one of his statements was, everything changes and nothing remains still. You also saw this concept in the Chinese metaphysics of the yin and yang. The Eastern teachings are close to this, the idea of the qi or the ki. The ether is viewed as something that's dynamic, it's transmuting. So this is at the heart of subquantum kinetics. The concepts also tie in with process philosophers of modern times, like Alfred North Whitehead or Henry Bergson. This is the heart of the theory, is these 5 kinetic equations. These are like recipes. If you think in terms of the movie Matrix, this is like the computer code that generates the physical reality. If you were to map these reactions out, it would look like this. It actually has a geometric form, and it really involves a crossing of 2 reaction pathways. It's like a sequence of transmutations. These are like, think of them as like chemical reactions, but at the etheric level. A goes to G, goes to X, goes to omega, and then you have a crossing pathway where B reacts with X and produces Y and Z, and then Y is regenerated back to X in a loop. Now, the X and Y is involved in creating the electric field. Why do you need 2? Because to create polarity, where you have plus and minus in electricity, you need 2 entities, like the yin and yang. You have where Y is high, X is low, or X high, Y low. And the G is involved in the gravitational field. Here's a simulation showing the, I don't know if I can get it to repeat. Go back and do it one more time. It shows the flux going on, that these are continually dynamic, this transmutation. And this is going on throughout all space. And out of this dynamic ether, that if you can think that even this room is, everyone in this room is being sustained by this flux that's going on every cubic centimeter of space. This is the kind of the wave, the shape of the electric field of the particles that emerge, like the proton, positive charge, versus the electron, negative charge. The field is just the inverse. But you also have the gravitational field correlated. Here you have a proton generating a gravity well, an electron a gravity hill, just sort of like what would fit with Brown's work. Now, when I was first developing this theory, I was seeing this. I said, my gosh, it's predicting 2 polarities for gravity, and standard physics doesn't acknowledge that, and I saw that was probably a problem. I was a little uncertain, am I off on the wrong path? And then I discovered Townsend Brown's work. There was an article published by William Moore in UFO magazine, and I investigated further, more and more, and I realized, well, here's a confirmation of what the theory was predicting. It's just it wasn't common knowledge. It wasn't something taught in university programs. Now, here's an example of how the particle emerges out of a vacuum fluctuation, 0-point fluctuation. This was a simulation done just last year by a fellow who he graduated top of his class both in physics and mathematics from UCLA. So he had 2 degrees. He became very interested in subquantum kinetics and wanted to help out on the simulation. Up until then, I hadn't done any simulations. This is not my area. And on his laptop, he wrote the equations, and we're creating here things that don't exist in the literature. This is the first time a dissipative soliton has been produced that has characteristics similar to what they observe in particle scattering experiments. If you want, I can rerun that. You can watch that. And we've even shown motion in a gravitational field. So it replaces general relativity. You don't need spatial warping because these are done by the etheric gradients. You don't need a Big Bang because matter comes right out of space. It's nucleated from the zero-point fluctuations. And so it's a process of continuous creation. And once a particle forms, it makes it easier for another particle to emerge. So you find that matter breeds more matter. So it's very much like biological reproduction. That you have mother particles producing daughter particles, and galaxies will grow in size over time. And this has all been supported by the Hubble Space Telescope data. You find that galaxies further out were much smaller. In our own galaxy, 99% of the matter produced that's in our galaxy came from the core. The core, the rate of the production of matter is the highest at the core of a galaxy because it depends on the gravity field. The deeper the gravity well, the greater the rate of creation. Also, there are bangs, big bangs, but they're at the core, the centers of each galaxy. So that's where we have to be worried about big bangs, and they're ongoing. These are part of the creation process. Also, there are some people who have the ability to materialize things. Here is a picture of Sai Baba materializing vibhuti, which is a sacred ash. Now, if this was, if a physicist was trying to explain this, well, it's conversion of energy to matter. If that's the case, it would have refrigerated the entire city block to suck that kind of energy to create this amount of matter. This is basically a violation of the first law of thermodynamics. The first law of thermodynamics states that you cannot create energy out of nothing. It can only convert it from one form into another. Subquantum kinetics, on the other hand, allows this. It's possible for energy to come into being or matter to come into being or for energy to disappear. That the redshift, cosmological redshift, is due to energy disappearing. Now, applying subquantum kinetics also to the Brown saucers, so in effect, he was producing a G-well ahead of the saucer and a G-hill behind, and this was sort of like surfing the gravity gradient. As the saucer moved forward, the ions it was emitting were also moving right along with it, so this gravity gradient would move along too. So it's like picking itself up by its bootstraps, in effect. Again, this is violating Newton's third law. You get action without reaction. Now, after his press conference, he put together this proposal called Project Winter Haven, which he presented to the Navy. And this was in 1953, January 53. And the proposal was, was suggesting to develop a saucer interceptor with Mach 3 capability. So he's trying to get the Navy interested in his work to apply it in aviation. He said that extrapolating the performance of laboratory disk prototypes, that he predicted that larger flying disks operating at electric potential of 5 megavolts could be made to attain speeds of 1,150 miles per hour, Mach 1.5, which was very interesting because just a few years earlier we'd broken the sound barrier. So this was in the range of what we were accomplishing in the Air Force with our most advanced jet planes. The report also predicted that with voltages and equipment then available, larger disks could be built that would be capable of speeds in the upper atmosphere of 1,800 miles per hour, or Mach 2.4, far faster than they had achieved at that time in 1953. On page 3 of the Project Winter Haven proposal, there's a very interesting sentence at the bottom, very revealing, in fact, which at the time I wrote my book, Secrets of Antigravity Propulsion, I hadn't noticed this, and otherwise I would have put it in. It says, in recent years, assuming that Brown is writing this, in recent years, as additional data of a confirming nature became available, the research has been associated with government research projects of a highly classified status, and publication has been precluded. So this explains why nobody's heard of Brown. He wasn't allowed to really give any details. The only paper he published on this was that 1929 paper in a pretty much lay journal or magazine. Usually if you approach a physics professor, have you heard of Townsend Brown's work on electrogravitics, he'll say, where did he publish, which journal did he publish this in? Well, the fact is, even if he wanted to, he couldn't. He wasn't allowed to, if we believe what's said here. So, on the other hand, Einstein was able to publish wherever he wanted. But as you find out, actually Brown's work was trumping Einstein's. Einstein's is something we have to now consider as classical. We have to get beyond that, otherwise we won't advance. We'll be still with our feet on the ground here. Now, Brown, at the same time he gave this Project Winter Haven report to the Navy, he made a demonstration to the Navy at Pearl Harbor. This was his second demonstration now. By the way, he was stationed for a time at Pearl Harbor, so he had contacts there. And he flew 3-foot diameter discs. He's holding one. And it said that the speeds were so astounding that the whole subject was classified. So very little is known about the details of this, except in 1956, Interabia magazine mentioned that the speeds of several hundred miles per hour were attained when he charged this to something like 150 to 200,000 volts. Now, also, I came upon a letter that was sent to me by Tom Terman, who is a researcher interested in Brown's work back in the 70s, and he was corresponding with Brown and inquired about the Pearl Harbor demonstration. And Brown wrote some details back. He drew this picture. This is drawn by Brown himself. It shows the setup. They hung this carousel arrangement, similar to what he had in his laboratory, but much bigger. Now he's showing a 50-foot diameter course and a 50-foot distance to the roof, where they had gimbals to hang this. And you can imagine these were probably 5 or 6 feet off the ground. So just from the edge of the arm to the disc was probably 40 feet. And well, based on this diagram, I couldn't resist to reverse engineer to explain what would have been going on here. From the angle, it tells something. So if you assume each disc weighed about 3 pounds, looking at the angle and the diameter here, you can calculate that this applied a velocity of about 11 miles per hour for a radius of 24 feet, which is not astounding because he got speeds much higher in his laboratory. Now, I can only assume that Brown was trying to low-key the whole thing because he didn't want to give out classified information, so he wanted to make it look like it was an experiment similar to what was known, what was unclassified. When you plug in the equations 300 miles per hour, if we take for, I believe what was published in Interabia magazine, we find that these things were really whizzing around, that the arms of his carousel would have been stretched out over, with 100-foot diameter course, and would have been making about 1.5 revolutions per second. So you can understand why they would have been so astounded to classify this. You can sort of figure how much power would have been needed to do this just to overcome air drag, and I came up with 50 kilowatts for both airfoils. This is just plugging in reasonable figures, and this is the equation you use for that. Now, it may be that Brown could have broken the first law of thermodynamics with his demonstration because it's very likely he wasn't putting more than 6 kilowatts into his device to power it. You figure he could have gone to 200,000 volts and 30 milliamperes. And that's being very liberal, based extrapolating from his experiments, his laboratory, where we do know the current and voltages that he used. And so if you put 50 over 6, you find that he would have been flying at 8 times over unity. In other words, 8 times the energy required to drive these, but only putting in much less. Of course, by charging the leading edge of this, there is an effect where you reduce the air drag just by having this ion charge in front. So even if you, let's say, cut in half the air drag, which is an enormous reduction, still you're 4 times over unity. So this would have shown to them, once they did the calculations, that he was basically breaking laws of physics here. And that would have been another reason they would think to classify it, because it would help keep the cover, because nobody would believe that it was so good. Now, in 1956, I came across this report called Electrogravitic Systems. I was researching electrogravitics at the Library of Congress in 1985 to see if I could find more information about it. And I was looking through the gravity catalog. In those days, they had card catalogs. And in the whole catalog, I went card by card. There was only one card in electrogravitics, and that was for this study, which was missing from the library. Somebody had apparently stolen it. So they did a search, and he was at the computer terminal there doing his search, and he says, "My gosh, this is a very exotic study. There's only one library in the whole U.S. that's listed as having this." I said, where is that? He says, Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. So I requested through interlibrary loan. I figured, well, it's worth a try, and went to a library in Alexandria, and it turns out they sent it. And I immediately made 10 or 20 copies. Later, for several years, I would show it to friends, and by the way, it was at one time classified confidential, and you see the blacking out mark there. They crossed it out, so apparently they allowed it to be released at that time. Tom Vallone got interested in publishing this in a book, so he published a book called Electrogravitic Systems, and had this and my paper where I reverse engineered the B2. Now all of this is in my book, Secrets of Antigravity Propulsion. I have the whole report reproduced in the appendix. Now, what you figure is they were promoting Brown's work. Brown, apparently they became very excited with this, saw this as the next step for the aviation industry. And the group that were putting this out, it's called Aviation Studies International, were basically a defense think tank. They would sell their reports to defense companies. And they also had a newsletter called Aviation Week, which went out every week or so to give news items of what was going on. And they would report every so often on electrogravitics, saying, okay, this company or that company has gotten interested and they're building rigs. And so this helped catalyze the whole industry, because other companies would be reading this and say, geez, this company Glenn Martin is doing research. Why aren't we doing this? So we should be getting in on this too. And pretty soon there were a whole host of companies, and it reads like a who's who of companies. Boeing, Douglas, you'll recognize some of these fairly well-known, General Electric, Glenn Martin, Hughes Aircraft, Grumman, Lockheed, Sperry Rand. And the 1956 report was sort of like a summary report summarizing the progress over those 2 years. So basically they took Brown's ideas from zero and just catalyzed this whole industry. It was actually, by that time, it was being funded in small amounts by the U.S. government. They were putting in $5 million into researching these test rigs at that time. But, and you even had some articles come out, like in the Herald Tribune, Product Engineering, Business Week, and there was a lot of excitement. They were talking about the interest of the engineering community in this new technology, and they were blue skying this, that we'll be having new mode of travel, and 10 years from now we'll be able to go supersonic speeds, just basically change our life on the planet. But then it seems that the whole subject went black. There was no news reports after 1959, and this was an article by Charles Carew on Canadian aviation, and he's here talking about Glenn Martin. He says, the author has not been able to determine whether Glenn Martin Corporation has discontinued its anti-gravity program or made a significant discovery which has elevated it to super top secret category, since no information about the project has recently been available. So even though these companies like Glenn Martin were giving interviews before, suddenly there was no more information coming out. And 20 years later, you had the B-2. And we'll talk about this next, of how Brown's technology appears to have been implemented into the B-2 advanced technology bomber. So why is it advanced technology? It's not only that it's stealth, it's also because it's using an entirely new mode of propulsion. This diagram is a sketch from Townsend Brown's patent that he applied for in 1958 and was finally granted 7 years later in 65, which is interesting. It would take so long being held up to actually issue, but at least it was something, it gives us something. And we see he's proposing this to use the idea that he had in his disk models to use it on a large-scale craft, charging the leading edge with positive ions and dumping the negative ions into the exhaust. It would have a jet engine to create the ions, and this was a special kind of jet engine called a flame jet generator, high voltage electrostatic generator. And here in his patent he showed how it would be able to create high voltages. Basically, it's very simple. He just takes a regular jet engine and they retrofit it by putting a needle electrode in the exhaust that's emitting ions, just like your air ionizer, air purifier in your home. And the exhaust then carries those electrons down away, and the grid picks up the voltage and is able to recycle that. But by the time the electrons get to the grid, you're up to 15 million volts. It works like a Van de Graaff generator. And then Aviation Week and Space Technology magazine interviewed two Black Projects engineers in 1993 who spilled the beans that the B-2 charges the leading edge of its wing and dumps the opposite charges out the exhaust. So I put two and two together that this is basically a realization of Brown's patent. And here's an actual clip from a Northrop Company video that shows, you see this orange hue there on the wing indicating a glow. There seems to be something electrostatic going on there. So if we see this in terms of gravitational fields, he's generating a gravitational gradient that would, that's in this direction, going towards the positive pole, and it acts on the craft to propel it forward. But this is not all that's going on. It's not just gravitational. There's also unbalanced electrostatic forces. And here, this is an example of Brown's work he did with electrokinetic thrusters. He termed them electrokinetic, meaning that move under electric charge. And they're what are termed asymmetrical capacitors, meaning that the one electrode, the upper electrode, is larger than the lower electrode. And as you see, it bears some resemblance to flying saucers. What happens is when you have an asymmetrical capacitor, the forces on the negative are very concentrated because it's a small electrode. So you develop a tremendous repulsion because the negative ions that are being, the field that's being created by those negative charges is acting on those charges to push them, to actually repel them. And the same is happening on the positive electrode, but the field there fans out, so it's much more diluted. It's much weaker propulsion back. So the result is you have an unbalanced force. Now, in conventional field concept, conventional theories view the electric field somehow anchored to the charges. So with conventional theory, you would conclude, well, this can't move. All it can do is induce stresses in the dielectric. However, with the subquantum kinetics ether theory, you realize that these charges are producing the field in the ether. And they're not bound to that. The field is not bound to the charges, but it can act on the charges. So you're putting more pressure from the negative to the positive as opposed to from the positive to the negative. So the result is the craft moves. And just like in his earlier experiments, he would have had to repeatedly charge and discharge this type of craft to get it to maintain its force, to avoid this polarization effect. And the B2, if applied to the B2, you see that the front, at the front of the B2, you have the positive charges going into the bow shock, which creates really an umbrella-like electrode in front of the craft. So it's almost like you have a reproduction of his electrokinetic thruster here. The positive is very spread out, umbrella-shaped, and the negative is in a jet stream is very tightly compacted out the back. And the result is that you get an unbalanced force now pushing the B2 forward. Also, because of the bow shock bending back, you get a lot of the repulsive forces actually even from the positive. Instead of pushing back, they'll be pushing forward. So the faster it goes, the more force it develops pushing it forward. It can actually turn off its engines, its gasoline-powered engines, and go on scooped air. So it's basically a free energy machine because it's this whole unbalanced force. It's action without reaction, and extremely over unity. Now, one way of measuring the ability of these is through the thrust to power ratio. How many newtons of thrust versus how many kilowatts you put in. And Brown's is, well, let's say a jet engine. I wish I had a pointer to show some of this because the pointer doesn't work on the screen. But a jet engine is at 15 newtons per kilowatt. Newton is that's about like 4 pounds of force for a kilowatt, enough to cook your turkey. The space shuttle main engine is 100 times less than that. Oh, thank you. And so looking at Brown's barium titanate thruster, this is based on data that came out of his electrokinetics corporation. They did some tests, and this is just extrapolating from his data. you get phenomenal thrust to power ratio of 70,000. That's 5,000 greater than the jet engine, about hundreds of thousands times greater than the space shuttle main engine. And in terms of, I should also mention there's also the Laforgue thruster, which was listed there, which also has great thrust to power ratio. This was invented by a French inventor and patented, and the patent expires this year, so anyone can make it now. Jean-Louis Naudin has demonstrated this working. And this compares the efficiency of this to the jet engine. For example, jet engine is 30% efficient, approximately. If you go to this barium titanate thruster that Brown was using, you're up to 140,000% efficiency. In other words, 1,400 times over unity. Now, getting back to Mars, suppose we were interested in going to Mars. This doesn't show any of the interesting features like the bases or the tubes and tree features that you see in some pictures, but it's some beautiful landscape there. This, by the way, is mostly ice sheet. Mars is mostly covered with ice, with dust. It's like tundra. So 90% of this is water if you melt it. Suppose we want to get there with this technology. Let's say you do some calculations. Suppose the craft weighs 100 tons, and we use the Brown's electrokinetic thruster, the high-powered one, 40 centimeter diameter, 20 centimeter deep thruster, and suppose we have 6,000 of these. Each thruster develops 35 newtons. That's about 9 pounds thrust. And so altogether, you've got 21 metric tons of thrust. So this actually can be powered by a bank of solar cells, as it turns out. So the power requirements are so little. With 21 tons of thrust acting on a 100-ton spacecraft, you get a G of 0.2 G, so about 2/10 the acceleration of gravity, with a power requirement of only 3 kilowatts. It's enough, small enough you can just use photovoltaic array. And compare this, now here's the course, what would be going on to go to Mars. We'd start out for the first day, we would be accelerating. With that G-force, we could accelerate to 200 times the speed of light, 200 kilometers per second in one day. Then we would turn off the thrusters and just coast for a couple days. And then the final deceleration phase would be another day. So we could get to Mars in slightly under 5 days. And figuring the power consumption that would be required, it's less than $25 if you figure 7 cents kilowatt hour. Now, compare this to the space shuttle. The space shuttle weighs about the same amount, 78 tons versus 100 tons. We're talking about the empty weight. But the space shuttle has 2,000-ton rocket to lift it up into orbit. And just one shuttle launch costs $450 million just for the fuel. So compared with $25. So, I mean, it's not a bad thing, really, that we don't have the space shuttle operating after this, you know. Now, suppose we want to go on interstellar flight to the nearest star, Alpha Centauri. That's 4.37 light years away. There's an interesting technology developed by Eugene Podkletnov, which is able to generate gravitational pulses. Basically, it's a discharge of high voltage, charges up some capacitors to 2 million volts, and discharges them to anode through a superconducting disk. And what he found was that even though the electrons in the discharge stopped at the anode, a gravity pulse continued to propagate. but at superluminal speeds. Now, with his low-powered apparatus, he was able to get superluminal speeds of 64 C. And he did this by measuring, cutting, he had a path, a laser path that he would cut. He found it would be able to thrust a pendulum every time it was fired. He put a piece of carbon paper there, and bang, you get a 4-inch diameter imprint. It would be a 4-inch diameter tube of gravity impulse. So it was confined to it. It was almost like a laser, gravity beam laser. They would push books over at 2 kilometers distance. Even at 200 kilometers, it was still confined as a beam. And when he jacked up the power to 10 million volts with an even more sudden discharge, he was able to get a force enough to put a 4-inch hole through a concrete block wall or dent a 1/2-inch steel plate. This whole technology is explainable also in electrogravitics, because here, when you have discharges, you develop what's called a very high virtual charge. And if you associate charge with gravity, it means you're able to create a very strong gravitational force. By the way, I explained this to Pakhmanov, and he's totally in accordance with the subquantum kinetics explanation of what's going on. Tesla also observed these forces with his shock discharge. And I conducted an experiment at Guy Obolansky's laboratory. A guy has a Tesla wave generator, a large mushroom electrode, which he produces 200,000 volt pulses, and these are electric shock fronts that come off of this. And we actually measured superluminal speeds with this. He sent this across. We were measuring the wave when it arrived at various points. These are ports. This is the floor of his laboratory, and this is the basement. He's got it in the basement. And he had an oscilloscope up here, so we'd measure the time it took for the pulse to go from one point to the other, and we would have different points here. And very interestingly, it started out at 6.5 times the speed of light, very close to the electrode, and decreased as it went away. But still, it was superluminal even after 3.5 meters. Now, nobody else has done this. I mean, I've studied the scientific literature. We're the first. It's published in my book, Secrets of Antigravity Propulsion. We just haven't taken the time to repeat the experiment to the point to publish this in a refereed journal. So this is basically shocking material from the standpoint of the physics community. This would basically destroys special relativity. The idea is that the wave is surfing on the ether pulse. What the shock does is it pushes the ether forward. It creates an ether wind, and the shock front then surfs on the ether wind. So you get C relative to the ether, but now you're pushing the ether on top of that. And that's the way Pakhmanov's beam works. By the way, with Pakhmanov's beam, with his high-powered beam, he was measuring 3,000 to 4,000 C. He hasn't published that. He just told me, confided to me. He used atomic clocks to measure this. The other results, the 64C, he and Modanese are publishing a paper in a book, ebook, which will be coming out in a few months. So let's say we use these kinds of thrusters to propel us. For the first month, we would accelerate up to, let's say, suppose we use Brown's thrusters for subluminal speed just to save energy, because Pakhmanov's device is very energy hungry in its current status. It doesn't mean it can't be engineered to be much more efficient. But let's say we use Brown's thrusters to get us up to 85% the speed of light for the first month. Then we jump to super light speed by using Pakhmanov's impulse beam generators. Basically pushing a tunnel of ether in the direction we're going. And it's nice because it deflects any rocks or asteroids out of the way, because it's a repulsive beam. So after only 1 week, now we have reached 200 times the speed of light. In terms of Star Trek lingo, that would be like warp 5. Okay. Then at that point we reverse our thruster and decelerate for another week back down to sublight speed, and then have Brown's thrusters bring us back down. And there we are. We arrive in 2.5 months. So superluminal travel is possible based on existing technologies. The only thing we have to overcome is the energy requirements. For Pakhlenov's beam to develop 5,000 G propulsion, you would need 600 terawatts, which is 200 times the average power consumption of the US. So that obviously is impractical. However, by engineering the shape of the wave, I believe it can be at least dropped 1,000-fold in terms of energy requirements. And even so, you could do entirely without Pakhlenov's beam and just use Brown's thrusters, which are very economical. They just travel at sublight speed, and it would get you there in 5 years instead of 2.5 months, where you'd be running the engines for 3% of the journey. And there it's only 1.7 terajoules. It turns out you only need 300 kilowatts in that case, which is like a submarine nuclear reactor to run it. You don't need to use nuclear power, you use free energy, of course. Well, on your journey, you would need some sort of navigation, so the natural thing would be to use pulsars. They make ideal navigation beacons for superluminal travel because they don't blue shift out of your receiver range because they're broadband. As you go accelerate towards the speed of light, any frequency will change. And these make ideal sources to navigate with. Each pulsar has its own identity. And in fact, I believe these are actually artificial beacons. They're not natural objects, that they were set up by other civilizations that do interstellar travel and need a way of navigating. And I describe this in my book, Decoding the Message of the Pulsars. And actually, there are certain of these pulsars that are beaming us a message, that certain geometrical relations are shown, like the pi ratio, Fibonacci series. And there's an intelligible message where they're warning us about the galactic core and the phenomenon of galactic core outbursts and their effect on Earth. In fact, they designate the one that, the largest one that affected us most recently at the end of the Ice Age. So this is something, the data is there. You can't question it. Like with a UFO, you see it once and it's gone. Here the data is published in referee journals, so the scientists cannot deny it. And all you do is you take it and you analyze it, which I've done here. And so you pretty much come to the conclusion that these have to be artificial. And I explain in the book how they can be generated. With our own technology, we could create these if we could get to a neutron star. You need a source of cosmic rays to create the beams. And it's not spinning, by the way. They are targeted beams and they're flashing on and off. Now, I don't know how much time I have, I guess 10 minutes. I want to talk about Project Skyvault. This is research that began in the late 1940s. It was carried out at the Rocketdyne Corporation right here in the LA area. In fact, a lot of this gravity propulsion technology and field propulsion technology was developed here in this area. The basic idea is it lofted a craft on microwave energy beams. It used masers and phase conjugate resonators to create the beams. I'll explain what phase conjugate resonator is. It also used sawtooth-shaped microwave waveforms. So the waves, the microwaves coming, it was a maser that produced the waves. Maser is like a laser operating at microwave frequencies. But then they shaped the wave, so it was no longer a sine wave, it was sawtooth shape. And they get better propulsion that way. They also use what's called metamaterials. These are materials with a negative index of refraction to increase the thrust. With a metamaterial, a beam of the right frequency will be able to create a thrust on it, whereas usually light beams or radio waves go through materials without interacting. With a metamaterial, it's able to create a force. This picture came actually from a 1996 spy thriller, Smith & Smith. It was on CBS. And may have been actually inspired by Project Skyvault. The news through the grapevine here travels to Hollywood, and so I'm sure that it made its way to this series because the resemblance was amazing. And it could explain these types of triangular craft, that these lights you see at the corners, they're not just navigation lights, they may actually be beam propulsion sources, microwave sources, and they're actually supporting the craft. So although you don't see visually, except where it might ionize the air near the craft, there are actual beams that are almost like poles, solid poles under the craft holding it up. And this may have been the reason why they called it Project Skyvault, the idea of vaulting on a pole. By manipulating the direction of the beams, they can move the craft very quickly in one way, the direction or the other. So maneuverability was something the military would be very interested in, which would have an advantage over something like the B-2. I heard about this through somebody who contacted me after a lecture, and he shared with me, sent me material in the mail. He had learned about it from his boss who had worked on the project at Rocketdyne, and then he communicated with an engineer on the project who told him some more information, which sort of updated him from the time his boss left the project to that time. And based on that, I was able to reverse engineer this based on what we know about physics and phase conjugation and so on. With phase conjugation, here's an example of what happens with a regular plane mirror. If you shine a laser on a target, the light scattered from the target hits the mirror, but it keeps diverging, sort of like entropy increases. With phase conjugation, here you have what's called a phase conjugate mirror, or a nonlinear crystal. Barium titanate, what Brown was using in his thruster, is ideal phase conjugating material. In this case, your laser beam hits your target. The light scattered from the target, now some of it is intercepted by this crystal. And this crystal is near your laser source, okay? Although it's poor picture here to show this, but you divert some of the laser light into your crystal, and this creates a hologram inside the crystal, which has all the information of how these light beams came in. And then you're pumping with the laser beam that hologram, and it creates a reverse laser light wave that travels back exactly the way the incoming waves traveled, and finally ends up converging at the laser source. So the advantage of this is the laser light cannot leave the system. It's bottled up, in effect. This reverses entropy. And here in my book, I devote 2 chapters to how this technology works. And here I've sketched a beam generator. You have the maser beam is generated here. It's shaped into triangular wave shape here for better thrust. Here you have a metamaterial to create even more force. Then it's reflected down through a focusing iris, like a lens, and you can then scatters from the ground and comes back up to your phase conjugator. Any light that goes off in some other direction is lost, but it ends up that the ones that make it to the phase conjugator end up dominating, and after just within a split second, it builds up a tremendous energy. And this type of system is used in military for locking on to aircraft. They can actually track the craft because this tracks automatically. So somewhat, if you give an analogy somewhat to the idea of the phaser beam in Star Trek. And also, you can create either repulsive forces or attractive forces with these beams. Just by reversing the polarity, like instead of going positive with your wave, go negative and it would reverse the thrust. Or just changing the shape. Here I show just by changing the shape of the voltage profile, this results in a repulsive gravitational force. This is an electrogravitic effect. This is based in subquantum kinetics concepts, which I won't go into right now. But if you change the shape now, instead of having a repulsive force, you have now an attractive force. And then this shows index of refraction for metamaterials. Here's a metamaterial produced by Boeing called the Boeing Cube. It's received some publicity. This has a negative index of refraction at microwave frequencies. Now, metamaterials are such that if you pick the right frequency, they develop a resonance which interacts with the beam and you can push things with it. So the question is, why would Boeing be interested in metamaterials? Interesting. Also, there's one natural substance which exhibits negative index of refraction, and that's bismuth. And interestingly, bismuth was found in the arts parts. There's research that was done at Oregon State University and at Princeton, in which they performed a test on a 4.5 micron thick layer of crystalline bismuth, sandwiched between two metal layers. And they found that it had negative index refraction if you exposed to a beam of 5,000 terahertz, which is in the near far infrared region of the spectrum. Now, arts parts had multiple layers of bismuth that were 1 to 4 microns thick, and they were sandwiched between also metal layers, in this case magnesium with a little zinc added, that were something like 100 microns thick. So it was maybe about a dozen layers there. Well, the thing is that metamaterials develop thrust. So with the proper frequency beam, you get a propulsive force on this skin. Now, it said that this was from the skin of the flying saucer. So it would be very interesting to test this. I would like to get a sample of this from curators of arts parts. And it's a very simple test, and once it's done, it pretty much closes the book on this. It shows what the purpose of this material was. So the current situation is that here on Earth we are fed conventional physics concepts which have resulted in conventional engineering, resulting in petroleum guzzling, polluting technologies like rockets, jets, automobiles, trains. While in the black projects that have been funded from our money secretly going to these, perhaps trillions of dollars, as you heard earlier, and they may even have created off-planet civilization, as was discussed this morning. They are not using the conventional physics. They're using unconventional ether physics. And they're working with gravity control, free energy. And it doesn't seem to be any direct benefit to us here. And so this is the problem. And the way I see it, we are like the cat. And the cage, the bars of the cage, are the physics that's taught in our schools, and it's used by the government in awarding the grants. And if you have any physics theory that's outside that, you can't get published or have a great difficulty to get published. We need to get in the face of the physics professors, of the physics community, of the government, and tell them that these laws are not correct. They are imprisoning us into the 20th century. It's sort of like they've frozen us in time in the 20th century by maintaining these bars. We need to get free like the bird. Thomas Kuhn wrote a book called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. It says normal science is predicated on the assumption that scientific community knows what the world is like. Scientists take great pains to defend this assumption. To this end, normal science often suppresses fundamental novelties because they are necessarily subversive of its basic commitments. Research is a strenuous and devoted attempt to force nature into the conceptual boxes supplied by professional education. But then he says, a shift in professional commitments to shared assumptions takes place when an anomaly subverts the existing tradition of scientific practice. So this is what he calls a scientific revolution, and that's what we need. The problem is that the scientific science today is in a state of corruption, and this is shown in this, discussed in this article by Marvin Herndon in the Dot Connector magazine, this issue, July issue. So what we need is to make a jump to anyway, not wait for the physics community to change, to develop a new physics, which I believe subquantum kinetics fulfills this role. I believe it will take us to this new technology, this new civilization that we only dream of presently, and sort of create the thing ourselves, not wait for black projects to pull their teeth to get them to divulge their secrets. Thank you.
Anyone off? I'm sorry about that.